to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. We are with you here on a Wednesday. Today is the 5th day of August in the year 2015. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you on this third consecutive day of programming this week. This is, as you know, our final live program this week. Our next one will be, of course, the first day, Monday of next week. It is a pleasure to be with you today. We apologize for the late start in our program today. We had a little bit of hold up on the production end of our program, and we weren't able to start until around about a half hour after our regular starting time, and we're a little bit beyond that. We're about 37 minutes into what usually would be our program, and we're just beginning now. But if you've stuck with us and you are with us, then we welcome you to the program. We invite you to participate actively in the program by giving us a call on the line that we have reserved for the purposes of getting you online. If you were with us yesterday, you know very early in our program we had John call from the western part of the country on the road somewhere, and it was a pleasure and just one fine call. John was a little bit reluctant. He thought maybe he was taking us off track a little bit, when in fact what he was doing was taking us in exactly the direction we were going to go anyway. So it was just absolutely a delightful call, quite insightful on his part, and we appreciated it. And I know those listening appreciated hearing a different voice other than mine. Again, our phone number, area code 304-663. 4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, it's obviously much easier, much more direct. And for those that are a little bit reluctant to get on the air, then I clearly understand that. And we welcome your email. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And again, I remind you that within the last 3 weeks or so, we've set up a Virtual Center Facebook page, and we invite your participation in that. In fact, you will, if you were with us yesterday, you'll recall that yesterday, about 2 or 3 hours before the program went live, I posted on the Facebook page an introductory, some context, if you will, from the day before, so that we would looked at one particular sentence from very early in Madison's Federalist Number 10, the sentence that begins with, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens." We looked at that one sentence, and my purpose, first of all, I think it's a key sentence to the entire document. There's absolutely no question about that. But even more than that, it is an example of the way that Madison writes, and the way that Madison is able to synthesize and get so much content and so much substance into one sentence. I think, again, it's a significant, a very relevant sentence to the overall thrust of the document itself. But my intent yesterday, and the piece that I put on Facebook was an effort to do this, my intent was to demonstrate a number of things. One was just an appreciation of the skill with which Madison crafted words. It's a brilliant sentence. It's extremely insightful. It's extremely substantive. The second issue that I wanted to emphasize by focusing on this sentence was the fact that Madison is writing on a level that is clearly well above the reading abilities of the general audience to understand. This is extremely important politically. Although the Federalist Papers are essays that appeared in the newspapers of New York to advocate ratification of the Constitution, they are written in a way which appeals to the mass audience on the one hand, and to those that Madison refers to as the most considerate and virtuous citizens on the other. Those who are looking for specific things in Madison can find them there. The general audience, the masses, if you will, those that read on an extremely superficial level, are not going to pick up the nuances and the substantive content, if you will, of Madison's message. Rather, they are going to be reading words much more than ideas. Inclined to not question, inclined to not read critically, inclined not to really engage substance and content. They are going to look at the words that Madison uses and are going to get a very positive attitude toward the new Constitution, because Madison's use of negative words indicates that the competitive nature of factions and the extent to which they traditionally cause problems and bring down popular governments throughout history, in the mass mind, are going to elicit a degree of agreement with Madison that he has identified a problem which clearly needs to be resolved. And of course, Madison's whole intent is to suggest that the Constitution is the resolution of these problems of instability, injustice, and confusion which exists within government under the Confederation, with power located at the state level rather than the national level. Madison is suggesting that with the creation of the Constitution, with the transfer of significant, checked, limited powers to the national level, many of the problems being caused under the Confederation period will be resolvable. To the few, however, to the most considerate and virtuous citizens, the problems that Madison seeks to solve, the problems which Madison believes the Constitution will indeed solve, are problems which principally would appeal to the few rather than the many, to the creditor class, because what Madison was effectively talking about here was the transfer of power from the state to the federal level, which effectively removed that power from the ability of the majority of the people to get control of it. In other words, Madison was basically saying at the outset of this document that the injustices and confusion inherent in state governments under the Confederation were the result of the ability of the majority of the people to gain access to political power. By removing that political power to the national level, Madison is in effect making it impossible for the majority to ever seize control. And what he doesn't say, but it's implied clearly, is that if the majority is unable to control government, then by definition, government control will be in the hands of minorities. In other words, what Madison is saying to the most considerate and virtuous citizens is that by ratifying the Constitution, power will be in a place where only you and the interests you care most about will be a priority. That's a message that the few want to hear. That's the message that Madison cannot allow the many to hear. Because in effect, power is being shifted from the majority to the minority in the process of shifting power from the state level to the national level. All of this is inherent and is contained within this one sentence. But in order to get that sort of meaning out of that sentence, one must read critically, one must engage the content directly, one must ask questions, and by definition, one's ability to read critically and to think cognitively will in essence lead you to meaning that a superficial reading will never reveal. That's really the message. So the third piece of the third objective, if you will, of focusing on this sentence yesterday on the Facebook posting was an illustration of the kind of analytical reading, critical reading, that will reveal meaning. And again, this is the level of education that all of us dream about, but so few of us ever gain access to. Toward the end of our program then, yesterday, we began to move on in Federalist Number 10, and of course that's what we'd like to do in today's program is continue to move. And very briefly, what Madison does, if you recall, is define a faction as being an interest group, a group of people who organize because they have a common interest or a common passion, which they feel that they have a better chance of satisfying if they unite. It can either be a minority or a majority. In other words, the size of the group does not define faction. What defines faction is the common interests which brings the group together and holds it together. And Madison explains that the faction, because it can be either a majority or a minority of the whole, is really the issue. That's the violence, the rivalry, the hostility, the competitiveness, which traditionally has brought down popular governments at all. But as we made clear in our presentation, in our critical reading yesterday of Madison, it's very clear that when you go back to Madison, to the complaints are everywhere heard sentence, and when he's talking about creditors and debtors, that if you look at the creditor-debtor issue on the one hand and the issue of minority-majority on the other, it's very clear that when you connect the two, your debtors are your majority, your creditors are your minority. So if you are in the process of shifting power from the majority faction to the minority faction, you are in effect shifting power from the debtor group to the creditor group. You are making majority rule impossible. So that really is important, an important piece of information as we look at Madison's effort to address the issues of faction. And then Madison, and this is where we kind of, right at the end of the program yesterday, we kind of concluded. Madison lays out a scheme for addressing the problem. In other words, this is how the Constitution of the United States is going to address the problem that the opening paragraphs of Federalist Number 10 have described. And Madison points out that if factions are the problem, then he points out that there are two ways of curing the mischiefs of factions. If we want to address the problems that factions are creating in our governments, we have two ways we can go. We can either eliminate the causes of faction, or we can control the effects of factions. If we can't eliminate the causes, then I guess all we're left with, Madison reasons, is to find a way to control the effects. Then Madison says, okay, let's look at the issue of eliminating the causes first. He said there are two ways of doing this. You can either destroy the freedom, the liberty, which is essential to the existence of faction. In other words, you can take away people's freedom to join factions, to belong to factions. That's one possibility. The other possibility is giving every citizen the same opinions and the same passions and the same interests as everybody else. In other words, you would eliminate the problems associated with factions if you made it illegal for people to belong to them, or you would eliminate the problems of faction if everybody had exactly the same interests and passions and concerns. In other words, if everybody was the same, if everybody was equal, then there'd be no reason for people to participate or to join factions. So those are the two ways to deal with the issue of eliminating the causes of faction. Take away people's freedom to belong to them, or eliminate the need for them by making everybody the same.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
As we ponder all of this, and I remain eternally in your debt for making Federalist 10 part of my cognitive life, because I think about it a lot.
Oh, I don't think you can help but doing that, Bob.
Oh no! Once if you've read it once, you're never done with it. It's
no,
and I mean no disrespect when I say it's kind of like reading a gospel, because it keeps yielding up meaning.
It does, Bob. I think it's a good analogy. You're right.
But one of the things I find myself asking myself is, typically when I read Madison talk using the word faction, my first inclination, and I suspect that of many others, is to think political parties.
Right.
Yeah, Republicans, Democrats, Greens, what
right.
have you. But he means more than that, doesn't he? I mean,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, and you know, when you use the phrase an interest group,
right?
I was thinking about because there really is one of these, the American Coal Ash Producers Association.
Okay, that's an interest group. Right, exactly.
Or the Grange, or the American Dairy Board.
Or manufacturers, or creditors, or bankers, or insurance interests, or doctors, or teachers, or firemen, or policemen, or on and on and on. People whose participation in life is so similar that what benefits some of them benefits all of them, and what hurts some of them hurts others. In other words, their interests become so common that they see the benefits of uniting.
Yeah, and so
I want to get what they want.
I want to proceed slowly here, because I want to try to make sure that I get this right. In Federalist 10, Madison is talking about the dangers of faction to the political process,
right,
and to constitutionally instituted Republican government. Am I okay so far?
Okay.
So he's not saying, when he talks about faction, that it's necessarily bad if the farmers of upstate New York want to band together to battle the apple weevil. Okay, because that's okay. That's okay.
Right.
It's if the Upstate New York Apple Weevil Association begins to affect political policy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair distinction?
Yes. Yes.
So when he talks about the question of either making them illegal, or what you're in right now, which is why I interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, I don't think you want to. I think I agree with him. You can't make that illegal.
No.
But within the meaning of faction, given the experience that we've had over the last couple of 100 years, might we have been a better nation had we not had we not allowed these interest groups to utilize political leverage?
Mm-hmm.
By
I see.
Let them do what they're constituted to do. But just like we say in the tax code, that there's not going to be any politicking from the pulpit.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. Yes. But it's and again, I'm not taking issue with you, Bob, but I'm trying to put what you're saying into Madison's context. Because what Madison I think is doing here, and I think this is part of the response to your comment. I think what Madison is doing here is pointing out that these seemingly obvious solutions to the problem are not workable, are not possible. In other words, what he's doing is eliminating all the options except the only one that he thinks can work. And rather than immediately start with the one that he thinks can work and come up with arguments to support it, what he's doing logically is eliminating all the other possibilities except that one. In a sense, he's directing everybody's focus to where he wants it to be so that he can present what he believes is the most workable option, and he will win solid support for it because he will have eliminated all of the other options that people would raise if he introduced the optimum solution at the beginning. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. In other words, he destroys the opposition before he advances his own cause.
He's eliminating all the obvious places that people could use to try to challenge what he wants to present. And he's doing it that way. And one of the points that I wanted to make here, and Bob, the fact that you joined in when you did, I think is perfect timing. Because I think it's important to think about, just not to think a lot about, but just to recognize the process that Madison is using here, what he's in effect doing. This is so classic Enlightenment that I think it's important. And I think it's important here to recognize Madison's background and where Madison's education comes from. And what I mean is...
He's no Jeffersonian raked rubbish.
No. No, exactly. He ain't the rubbish. Exactly. Madison went to a private school. At the age of 11, he spent 5 years in an academy run by a Presbyterian minister named Donald Robertson. Donald Robertson was an immigrant from Scotland. He had come from Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and he had been educated in the Hutchinson, Adam Smith, Scottish philosophical ideas. So Robertson was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment. And that meant that they accepted certain things as givens. And one of them is, and this is one of the points I think we're going to have to deal with at some point in this, Bob, is that this idea, when Madison says if men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all, that has led a lot of people to believe that Madison is Lockean, that Madison is really focusing on the traditional Enlightenment idea of original sin, of fallen man, and you know, the idea of the banishment from the Garden of Eden and the stain of original sin, and the implication from that man's nature is evil and man can't do what he should do unless he's forced to do the right thing. His inclination is to do the wrong thing, not the right thing. That's where a lot of people want us to go. That's where conservatives want to take us. But the fact of the matter is, the Scottish school of the Enlightenment doesn't go there. The Scottish Enlightenment believes that there is an innate element of goodness in everybody, that there is this clash between one's head and one's heart, if you will, for the struggle that's always going on, because the Scottish school of philosophy believes that there is what Francis Hutcheson called a moral sense. In other words, that morality is instilled in every human being. The ability to know right from wrong, good from bad, is inherent within all of us. But that we are dissuaded because we are tempted. Our ability to reason and think logically and plan and calculate and scheme and organize with other people in order to create a powerful interest group, in order to get all these things, work against the moral sense. And the Scottish philosophers believe that there's always this struggle. And they also believe that the moral sense is most likely to win in that struggle when the individual is working things out as an individual by himself. But when you get into groups, factions, when you become fired up with other people who believe and want the same things you do, your moral sense of right and wrong tends to be pushed further and further into the background, so that your inclination is to go along with the crowd rather than follow your principles.
Or the mob.
Or the mob, yeah. And so that's really where Madison's coming from, I think. Because Madison is a product of this school. I mean, he was educated from the age of 11 to the age of 16 in this private academy of Donald Robertson's, and Robertson was a product of the Enlightenment school. Then, when Madison graduated, he goes to Princeton, and the president of Princeton is John Witherspoon, and Witherspoon is a direct product of the Enlightenment. He came over from Scotland to assume the presidency of Princeton University. So Madison goes to Princeton, completes his bachelor's degree in 3 years, stays an extra year in order to take more classes, more graduate classes from John Witherspoon. So my belief is that there's more of the Scottish philosophical school within Madison than conservatives in our nation would allow us to believe. They want us to believe that man is nothing but a self-interested animal who must be controlled by authority and power.
How do they square that with their vision of American exceptionalism, Dr. Bill?
They basically associate this idea of self-interest, and all of them, I mean, I think the Scottish folks too, accept the fact that there is this self-interest within all of us as well. There's this constant struggle. But man's reason is always calculating how to satisfy your self-interest, never your moral sense. The moral sense is deep within us.
You know, I get the sense that we could do a month of Sundays on 10 and 51 alone.
It's fabulous. It is absolute, Bob. It's absolutely fabulous.
It's in many ways a precursor to some of the realism work that would be done in the latter part of the 19th century. You know, the James Brothers and the literary movement toward that.
Yeah.
Because it's the individual versus group think.
That's right.
And
That's
it's and all these people, all these various schools, I think we must remember, were grounded in the classics. So when you talk about how Madison, how he deconstructs the opposing arguments before he advances his own, that's classic Ciceronian rhetoric.
Right.
Right.
It is, Bob.
That's straight out of Cicero.
And that's the way Madison thinks, and that's the way he addresses problems. And my point, and I think for this I've got to credit Gary Wills, because Gary Wills is, in my mind, the scholar who does the best job in today's world of marrying these two approaches, and pointing out, first of all, pointing them out in Jefferson, but also pointing them out not only in Madison, but in Hamilton. And basically, what we're talking about here is, because you raised the question of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is driven by the belief in individual freedom. And the assumption is the purpose of individual freedom is to pursue your self-interest. That's what the entire system needs to be about, is protecting people's freedom so that they can pursue their self-interest. And so those who end up at the top doing very well are not challenged or not criticized, but rewarded and praised. In other words, success in our society should not be something to be ashamed of. It should be something that people appreciate, because they all understand that in a competitive, in a fair, competitive system, talent and ability and skill will surface, will come to the top, and it should be rewarded. And the assumption is that the order of our society is based on the idea of individuals pursuing their own self-interest, all going in the same direction, government's job being to make sure that their freedom is not limited. And that's the approach. That's the Lockean Hobbesian approach. Hobbes believed that self-interest was what it was all about. That if there was a moral sense, it was so buried so deep that it could never come out. And so consequently, the only solution the only hope of creating a stable society, in Hobbes's thinking, is to create the super powerful government, the Leviathan, who will establish order so that people's self-interest can be enjoyed, because you know that if anybody steps out of line, the power of the power at the top will come down and enforce the rules. And so in a sense, it seems to me this is where the American exceptionalism folks want us to go. And my concern is, and there's something Madisonian about this, I think, because their approach is, the only way that they can sell this is to bury the Scottish school of philosophy, is to ignore, overlook, criticize, or dismiss this idea of the moral sense, this element within Madison. And the irony, what really makes it difficult for them, is that one can find the moral sense in Adam Smith, as well as any of the other. Adam Smith was a leading personage in the Scottish Enlightenment.
Absolutely. And
Adam Smith, in his essay on moral sentiments, Adam Smith was very aware of the idea of morality. He was very concerned about the poor. And his point was that you needed to preserve community, and those people that were doing very well needed to take care of those who were struggling in order to preserve the community. Because if the community fell apart, then nobody would be free. You'd have authoritarian dictatorial government. You'd have military law or something. And so the argument is that we need to take care of each other. And Adam Smith believed, his essay on moral sentiments emphasizes this idea of the moral sense, of the concern each one for the other, that makes a community work. That aspect of Adam Smith the conservatives don't even want to acknowledge that he ever wrote something called an essay on on moral sentiments. And so that really becomes the problem. Madison approaches his issue here by eliminating all the options except the one he wants us to. Conservatives approach their idea of American exceptionalism by squashing all the other arguments, all the other ideas, so that people don't even know about them. So in a sense, they don't want people to know that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and all men being created equal and deriving their power from the consent of the governed and all the rest of it. The emphasis on equality, they don't want that. They want the emphasis on life, liberty, and property. That's the direction they want us to go with Jefferson. So they try to bury the other part. They don't have as much luck with Jefferson, but they've had pretty good luck with Madison. And they go to Federalist number 10 to do it, because Madison lays out all this stuff about factions being sown into the nature of man and all this other stuff, and they can point to that and say, see, self-interest drives everybody. That's what human nature is all about. And then I've heard conservative spokesmen in speeches say, the reason that this system is so brilliant, the reason that that there is such a thing as American exceptionalism, is because the Constitution as it was created works well because it's the only system that really deals with man the way man really is. Well, the fact of the matter is, it demands a certain definition of human nature in order to function. So therefore, that's the view of human nature we foist on our young people. We do everything. In other words, this idea of morality and conscience and all of this other stuff, we tend to bury that. We basically say separation of church and state, let the religious people deal with that. And so I think this document, Bob, is absolutely so important, and there's so much in it. I agree with you. It's wonderful.
Well,
I got a little bit carried away there.
No. I believe me, I was enjoying it. One of the things that I try to imagine him sitting there writing all of this and talking about faction, and it's not like he was arguing aesthetics or esoterics, because by the time he's writing this, there's already the burgeoning factionalization of a young nation, and it was going on at the time of the drafting of the Declaration over slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only getting worse by the time he's doing this, and it's going to get much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe he wasn't so much worried about the South as he was the anti-federal. Well, no, I don't know. Where does that play into it?
Well, he has to deal with the South because the Union can't work without the South. In other words, the biggest danger, in fact, the first 4 or 5 Federalist papers that John Jay writes, deal with the threat that Madison sees to the Constitution. And that is, a number of opponents of the Constitution argue that the only way we can make Republican government work is to recognize the differences between New England and the South and the Middle States, the plantation South, the commercial Middle, and the manufacturing, well, not manufacturing yet, but the commercial financial Northeast. And so what they are advocating is the creation of 3 separate small confederations out of the 13 colonies. In other words, divide the Union into sections or into separate confederacies in order to, it seems to be the most logical way to go to many of the anti-federalists. And Madison is petrified of this. And so and not only Madison, but Hamilton as well. And John Jay's first 3 or 4 Federalist papers are focused on the fact that we are all one people. We have the same heritage, the British heritage. We came here, the settlers came here to set it up, and the last thing we want to do is divide it. There's more to unite us than divide us, and that's the real thrust of the first few Federalist Papers, because that seems to be the major direction that opponents are going. Once the Constitution takes shape, then the Anti-Federalists shift, and that's when they start to push for amendments and push for a second convention. And to Madison, that would be suicide. Once you've got the Constitution, you got to get it through. You can't take it back you can't go back to the drawing table again. You'll lose it all. Madison believes, and Hamilton believes that as well. So, it'll get committed to death. And I really believe, when you first were talking today, Bob, you mentioned the issue of parties and factions, and I think, when Washington in his inaugural address in his farewell address, warned the nation about the dangers of parties, he was in his mind thinking faction. Because by definition, factions are divisive, and they're innately hostile. And we have remained perpetually divided unto this day. Exactly. But Madison's approach, and it's important to recognize that our two-party system was pretty much constructed more than anybody else by Madison when Madison was in the first Congress. And Madison began to, he along with Jefferson, led the Republic, the Jeffersonians, in opposition to the Hamiltonian Federalists in the early 90s. And so a lot of historians have pointed out the contradiction in Madison. He creates the Constitution because he wants to find a way to deal with the violence of factions. Then he gets into the first Congress and he begins to organize an opposition party to the government, to Washington's party. And what's the story here? Is Madison inconsistent? I've heard people say that Madison is first and foremost a Southerner, and he sees Hamilton's emphasis going towards the Northeast, towards New England, towards the financial groups in the eastern cities, and that Madison's Virginia plantation background, planter background, if you will, comes out, and once he gets into Congress, he becomes more of a Southerner, and that he's undergone some sort of metamorphosis from the Madison that constructed the Constitution. But in effect, what Madison does is come up with an idea, the two-party idea, of making parties not responsible. In other words, directing political party attention towards winning power by appealing to other groups, by creating conglomerations of different factions and different interest groups that can find ways to unite, even though they continue to have differences between them. And so our political system becomes a political uniter rather than a divider. And that's Madison. That's what Madison is talking about in the Constitution, is the idea that we need to find a way to bleed self-interest out of the policy process, out of the decision-making process. We need to make sure that we have leaders who are making policy, who are writing law, as much as possible, who are not self-interested. Who have a broad altruistic streak, I suppose. Right, exactly. And who will put the best interests of the public interest ahead of private interest. And yet, we really are still grappling with this, because I mentioned the tax code earlier and not politicking from the pulpit. Well, that generally applies across the board to 501c3s, and 501c3s are tax exempt, as you know, factions. Right. They are they're exempt from taxation, and they serve educational, religious, spiritual, yada yada. It's all there in the code. But here's what's interesting. 501c3s don't do much in the way of lobbying work because of the limitations upon them. Mm-hmm. And yet, somewhere along the way, the government also created 501c4s. Fours, right.
Which are specifically designed to be advocacy organizations,
right,
and are designed to be expressly political. And
right.
here's where I think Madison would have a fit. That's all well and good, I suppose, if you think factions should be able to come in and lobby the government to advocate for whatever it is they want.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, now you can be, and everybody knows that I'm associated with Coal River Mountain Watch. You can be a Coal River Mountain Watch and a 501c3, and you can live from hand to mouth, doing the work that is your mission.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't pay for any billboards that say "vote the bums out." Actually, you can say "vote the bums out." You just can't advocate that a particular bum be voted out.
No, that's right. That's right. And so the whole idea of 501c3 is to use the tax system to support
presumably good work.
Public service that is not politically driven or self-interested.
Right.
It's not going to benefit particular groups, but it's going to benefit the society as a whole.
Right. But here's the rub. The 501c4. Now, let's say you're the Amalgamated Genetically Modified Seed Corn Association of America, and you're just trying, and you're a 501c3, and you're just trying to inform and educate the public that, shucks, so what if our corn has a gene from an ocelot's pancreas spliced into it? It's good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. But but because they're an industry organization, they're going to have enough money to form a C4 to go in and change public policy so that all the corn can have a gene from an ocelot's pancreas in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, little public service organizations don't have the kind of scratch to form a C4 and come in and say, no, let's not have a gene from an ocelot's pancreas spliced into all of our corn.
Right.
And so Madison's fears about faction come true in that regard.
Right. I think the controversy that you point out is points to the difficulty of managing this. I think this is the complexity, the political complexity of this kind of system. When you talk about C34 501c34s, what I'm thinking of is the allegations from some months ago that IRS was flagging certain groups,
right,
looking for a conservative, right wing, pro-Christian, those kinds of things.
And that was so much hooey because they were flagging everybody.
And denying them 501(c)(4) status.
Right, but they were flagging everybody. They were flagging progressive organizations, too.
Right.
Because it has gotten completely out of hand.
Yeah, it's out of control.
And
exactly.
I think if you set the Wayback Machine to Orange County, Virginia, and went back and had a chat with Brother Madison about this, he'd say, well, of course. I mean, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, is this not a hell of our own making? I mean, it is. It's a hell of our own making, but the question is whether it's a hell. And it certainly seems it is.
Right, because as you get into this, by definition, you end up with situations where people with particular interests are able to gravitate into key positions in order to influence the decisions that are being made. I mean, Madison's whole idea is that if you follow the scheme as the scheme was designed, you would gradually bleach self-interest out of the process, so that as decision-making goes up the ladder, it becomes less and less self-interested and more public-interested. That's Madison's ideal. That's the ideal. And of course, it is an ideal. And I think Madison usually is not associated with idealism. But I really do believe that when you look at his system and you try to figure out what he was talking about, you begin to appreciate how incredibly idealistic this is, to imagine it would work. And of course, the reality is that it may not work perfectly, but Madison's position is if you continue to strive toward it, then in the process you're improving, you're moving toward the ideal, but you never get there. And and I really think in Madison's defense that's the position. But I believe that that in this issue of factions versus political parties, I believe we really need to give Madison his due, because he was instrumental in seeing that the factionalism he wrote so much about was so innate within this system that, in effect, what we're going to conclude, one of the things we're going to conclude here in Federalist number 10, is that the entire first portion of the document points to factions as being the basis of the problem. Once Madison eliminates all the options but one, the one he finally focuses on is you can't get rid of factions, so what you got to do is control their effects. So the only way to control the effects of factions, since you can't get rid of them, is use factionalism in order to build in an internal system of self-control, so that there's so much internal checking and balancing and separating powers and all the rest of it that you slow down decision making. You basically make it so difficult and so time consuming for major decisions to work their way through this process that it gives you the opportunity to bleed self-interest out of it. At least that's what I believe. And I think in a way it's extremely idealistic, but I also believe that Madison has created an analysis which indicates it's the only way you can go. That what you have to do is you have to force people to interact and engage their opponents. You've got to force the factions to find a way to resolve their differences by separating the things they have in common from the things that divide them. And that's Madison's whole idea of negotiation, of the search for consent, of these kind of things. You must force dialogue. You must force that. And that's why, this thing that's going on now among Republicans to try to kill the Iran thing. I mean, what Obama is doing is perfectly consistent with Madison's approach, that what you've got to do is you've got to engage your enemies. You can't ignore them. You can't isolate them. You can't, because you're not solving the problem, you're making it worse. You're driving your opponents underground and you're creating a bigger problem, ISIS, than if you dealt with them right up front at the very beginning and found and focused on the things that you agree with rather than the things you disagree with. I really believe that's Madison's message. And he believes that the model for this are the elected representatives in Congress. That Congress needs to set the tone. They need to be the model for willingness to engage, to compromise, to negotiate, to deliberate. And what's happening right now is just the opposite. The whole system that Madison created, these guys are breaking. I mean, the Cruzes and the rest of them who don't want to talk to their enemies. They want to isolate their enemies or bury them or blow them up or whatever. You can't do this. I mean, from Madison's thinking, this is the product of a system that we've allowed to reach this point. And it never should have gotten here. And I think that's what Madison did. He created a two-party system that would force the parties to compromise in order to win power, in order to have a chance to win political power in a majority rule system. You got to find ways to get along with the people that you don't agree with.
Well, let me ask an observation and then a question, and then I'm going to hush and let you just sort of wrap up over the last half hour.
Okay.
One, isn't it interesting that after Madison did such a masterful job of turning faction into a dirty word, it almost disappears from our political lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
No one. I was trying to think of the last time I heard anybody on TV in the for-profit media refer to a faction.
No, that's a good point.
I think
he turned it into a bad word.
I think we need to bring it back in exactly that sense. A bad word. We need to bring it back into common usage. The pro-war with Iran faction.
Right.
You know, not the
Right.
you see what I'm saying?
Or the pro-Israel faction.
Faction, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, I got you.
And I think they wouldn't like it.
No.
But secondarily, and let me see if I can pull this back. Dang it. I know. You talk about Madison essentially creating a two-party system. I always felt like that was sort of baked into the Constitution, but it's not. Of course, I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that says there shall be a two-party system.
No.
But what would it? Why that versus a more it is a non-parliamentary system insofar as, you know, you've got the executive, the judiciary, and the
right,
and the legislative. But if we wanted to, because I've made the argument time and again, and I stand by it, that there is no viable way for a third party to rise in the United States under the things as they are currently constituted.
That's exactly right.
And that if a third party does arise, it will simply replace the second party.
If it's successful, it will replace the smaller of the two major parties. But usually, what happens is that one of the major parties will begin to adopt portions of what the third party position stands for in order to eliminate the need for supporting them. In other words, what Hillary Clinton's going to end up doing is supporting some of the positions that are driving so many people to Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders' contribution to the political process is going to be that he was achieving so much political success in the campaign that he forced the major elements within the Democratic Party to adopt some of his positions in order to stop him. And so that's what third parties do. They affect policy.
Well, FDR did that, and not even because, you know, Bernie's running as a Democrat. So it's not even really a third party situation. But certainly the co-opting of different factional ideas is, I mean, consider FDR's adoption of that portion of Huey Long's "Every Man a King" platform that winds up in Social Security.
Right. Huey Long was speaking for speaking for an interest group or a point of view that was seriously threatening the Democratic Party. And the only way to silence them is to adopt a portion of what they're doing and saying, if you continue to support Huey Long, you can't win. But if we adopt some of Long's positions, then the people who are supporting him will come to us because they realize that they got a better chance of turning this into victory through us than they do through him. And that's, I mean, it's the same, it's like...
And it's a very cynical business, without a doubt.
Oh, yeah. We, for example, William Jennings Bryan in the late 90s with the populists. I mean, there's absolutely no question that the way the Democratic Party dealt with populism and dealt with the popularity of William Jennings Bryan was to ask him to accept the Democratic nomination as well as the populist nomination. Once he did that, then the Populist Party as a political force in America disappeared. And that was really the goal. That was really the goal of the Democratic Party, was to eliminate the populist third party opposition. And the way to do that was to adopt their leader.
So is there, and after this, I really will hush up and listen.
Okay, no, that's right. This is great because you can present this as monologue, but on the other hand, when it comes up this way, it's so much more interesting. It makes it more real.
For all of my third-party friends out there, and they are, because, see, the most, and it's sad because so much of what used to be the populist third-party or populist progressive wing of the Democratic Party has decided to go off and play in the weeds at being Greens.
Mm-hmm.
And my final question to you, like I said, and after this I'll hush, is within this Madisonian framework, is there any way that a Green Party can ever get a foothold so that there is a three-party system instead of a two-party system?
No, not in this system. I don't believe so. Because,
so where do okay? So I didn't hush. So where then, if they want that three-party system, which also implies a 12-party system or a 92-party system,
then you're changing the entire two-party system as we know it. You're moving toward the parliamentary.
Which means you are going to have to monkey with the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly. Because then what you're into is the whole issue of coalition governments, where in order to form a government that can govern, you've got to bring a number of third, fourth, and fifth parties together in order to build a coalition that can govern, and that's what makes many of these European democratic systems, so-called, so volatile. They change all. The governments, fall all the time because the coalitions break down, and therefore the governments can't govern because they've lost the support of particular coalitions. That's really the significance of the Conservative victory in Great Britain recently. Was Cameron's victory. Because the Conservatives won enough that they didn't have to find ways to work with other minority parties in Great Britain. See? They won such an overwhelming majority that they control Parliament, and they can enact their policies. The major difference, Bob, between that system and ours, if from a major difference, and I think it's the most important one, is the difference when you look at it from the perspective of the individual voter. Because the difference is, in those parliamentary systems or multi-party systems, voters are voting for the agenda of the party. They're voting for the particular positions that they want. In our system, because our two major parties are such broad coalitions, the citizen is forced to vote for the candidate rather than the particular ideology. So when you talk about a Green Party, you're talking about people who are working on a political party movement around the issue of the environment. The reality is that in Madison's world, there aren't enough people who care about that as their priority to create a majority and win power in our two-party system. Now, what changes this a little bit is the communication revolution, is technology, is the internet. Because we're facing the reality now of being able to build a national coalition through the internet that did not exist before. In other words, Madison believed that his system in Federalist Number 10 made it impossible for the majority faction to ever unite. But technology makes it possible for the majority faction to unite. And we're seeing that all over the world. Cell phones are being used to topple governments. I mean, cell phones are being used to get demonstrations in the streets, to get protests in the streets, to schedule them, organize them, time them, manage them, and everything else. I mean, this is a totally different world, and you know, the communication possibilities of our modern period really raised many of Madison's assumptions into question, because he believed by putting power on the national level, you make a majority coalition impossible. You make it impossible for the majority to organize, because it was not necessary. In order to gain power over the national political apparatus, you'd have to organize a majority of the total population of the whole country. And Madison believed you couldn't do that. In fact, Jefferson, as much as admits that, Jefferson said, there's no way in the world that no matter how much money you have, you can buy enough political support to create a majority on the national level. But now we have a situation with the Kochs and stuff where they're really testing this, I think. It really scares me because I'm seeing possibilities that I never thought would ever be there before, and we're seeing it now. So, you know, I mean, this conservative, Koch-funded, potential conservative majority based principally on political ignorance is something we've got to challenge. We've got to confront. And I believe the only way to confront it is to educate the citizenry so people can begin to see through it and not buy it.
And that takes a lot of money.
As long as people are buying this can work. I think we're seeing it on the state level. We're seeing, you know, these people are able to they're taking control at the state level, one by one by one state by another state by another state. And they're bringing into power, they're using their money to support candidates who have no political track record. There's nothing that your opponent or the incumbents can get on these people because they don't have any political record. But they have access to enough money to buy a political campaign that makes it possible for them to get elected. And once they get elected, the only way that they can stay in office is to make the source of the money happy. In other words, to follow the agenda that's being set by the powers that be who are generating the money, which is the Koch brothers and various organizations and corporations and PACs and all the rest of it. So in a sense, power is flowing legally under our Constitution. Power is flowing to the wealthy, and the Supreme Court bought right into it with Citizens United. They made it possible. I mean, they by eliminating caps on political campaign contributions, Citizens United made it possible for these people to pour unlimited amounts of money into our political process. And I think the only way that we can deal with that is to educate our people in such a way that they do not allow themselves to fall prisoner to this propaganda campaign. You know, when you look at the American Legislative Exchange Council, that ALEC group, and they're setting up model legislation all over the country. I mean, this is a centralized, well-organized, highly funded political process which is designed to produce revolution in this country under the constitutional system we have. It's using the current system to overthrow the current system. And somehow people need to know this, and they need to understand it, I believe. I mean, this is me talking, obviously, but anyway, that's what I believe, and I didn't mean to run off on. I took your comment and ran with it, Bob. I'm sorry, but
oh, no worries, no worries.
Go ahead. Anyway, but I really do believe. I mean, I really think that if people began to understand, if we can do this with Federalist Number 10. If people really understand what Federalist 10 was designed to do, how this system was designed to work, we'll begin to see, people will be able to see through a lot of this stuff. Because it's very obvious that the people who are orchestrating what I think is the threat in today's world don't understand this stuff. I mean, I don't think they really understand this stuff at all. And I think they're taking advantage because they know how the system is set up. They know what works, what's legal and what's not legal. And so far they've been able to cherry pick the history, the founders, in order to provide snippets of political support for what they're doing. When in fact, if you really read the founders, the founders would lead the opposition to these people. Because Madison's fear was revolution, civil war. I mean, that's why he wanted to open the ballot box and give people the opportunity to vote, irrespective of property ownership and stuff. It is to preserve the system. These people are threatening to destroy the system because what they will do is leave people on the bottom no option but revolution. And that's the one thing Madison was trying desperately to come up with a way to prevent. So these people are threatening the very basis of this constitutional system, of this republic. And I don't even think they understand the way they're doing it. They don't think they appreciate what they're doing. I don't think so. I don't think that these are I don't think that they're crazy people. I think in their own narrow frame of reference, they really believe that they're helping to save America. But they don't understand the America. The America that really exists is they threaten to destroy. And that's why I think this whole initiative, and I think what you're doing at the Horn and the programs that the Horn broadcast, I think it's so important to continue to bring the truth. And I mean that. You're bringing solid, substantive information to people, and you're teaching people how to deal with it. And once people do that, they're empowered. Rather than, this whole idea of corporations intentionally trying to confuse people and sow doubt so that people won't know what to believe, and they just say, whoever makes the best argument, I'll go along with it. Jesus, that's frightening, Bob. That's frightening, and that's what they're doing. So, anyway, that's kind of where I am. So, it looks like we've got about 10 minutes left in our program, Bob. Anyway, let me... yeah,
like I said, I figured I'd let you wrap up. And
okay, let me go. And Bob, I appreciate it. Thank you. I think you found a way to. I feel like a yo-yo on the end of the string, and I've just been bouncing up and down, and I love it. I love it. Thank you. Thanks a million. Let's kind of go back and put Madison in his place, so that when we revisit him next week, when we come back to Federalist number 10, we can all come back to and begin the same place. Because again, I think that many of the things that have come out in the conversation that Bob and I just had, the exchange that we just had over factions and parties, I think as we go through Federalist number 10, that interaction, that exchange that we just had is going to so inform those that will be able to join us that they will begin to appreciate, I think, what Madison is trying to do and why he's trying to do it. I do not believe that any of this is in any way un-American or incendiary or doing damage to the founders or the reputation of the founders or anything else. On the contrary, I think it speaks to the depth and to the vision of the people who created this country. And I think our challenge as citizens is to do all we can to understand what they gave us. In that sense, I think Franklin was right. Once we understand what they gave us, we'll better able to recognize the things that threaten what they gave us. And those who would overthrow or threaten what the founders gave us, the one thing that they can't afford, they can't allow, is information and understanding. Education is their enemy. Education, I believe, is our hope. And I think Madison, Jefferson, and all of them were on the right page about this. So again, just kind of putting back together again, so for purposes of conclusion, I think where we began here was talking about the way that Madison lays out for solution the problem. When he writes Federalist number 10, when he sits down to put together this essay, he has a plan. He opens with his explanation of how he defines the problem. Then he addresses all of the most likely obvious solutions to that problem and sets out to eliminate one by one all the possible options except the one that he wants us to seriously think about. And when I say he wants us to seriously think about, I think what I mean there is the people who really understand what he's talking about. I think we need to recognize that the vast majority of citizens could not understand. I get the biggest kick out of people, in my conversation, one-on-one conversation, and people say to me, "Oh, we read the Federalist Papers in high school, or we read them in college." I would suggest, no, you didn't. You may think you did, but you didn't. Because when you really read the Federalist Papers, I believe you become a different person. Because you begin to gain a sense of how absolutely brilliant and how well educated and well read these people were. Douglas Adair makes the point in his writing when he basically has a brilliant essay on Federalist Number 10. And the theme of his essay is the extent to which Madison gets a lot of his most critical ideas in Federalist Number 10 from David Hume. And Douglas Adair's essay is a comparison, clause by clause, phrase by phrase, paragraph by paragraph, of Douglas Hume and Madison's Federalist Number 10. And Douglas Adair is able to demonstrate beyond a doubt that Madison was able to resolve some of the most controversial issues that he confronted by relying on the analysis and the knowledge and understanding of David Hume. David Hume is one of the more prominent philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. When Garry Wills writes his book Explaining America on the Federalist Papers, most specifically, Wills addresses the issues on which Madison and Hamilton agree and or disagree. Then he goes into the two of the Federalist Papers only, number 51 and number 10. To Garry Wills, these are the two Federalist Papers that really are the keys. Garry Wills begins every chapter with a David Hume quote. If you look at the reviews of Garry Wills's book, you will find that the criticisms focus on the links with David Hume. Many, especially the most conservative critics of Garry Wills, criticize him principally because of his, I think, successful effort to link Madison and Federalist Number 10 to the Scottish Enlightenment through David Hume. Because once you make that connection, and once you appreciate Madison's debt to the Scottish Enlightenment, and once you appreciate the extent to which the Scottish Enlightenment was driven by this idea of the innate moral sense that helped to inform human nature, what that does is effectively create serious doubt. It weakens the foundation of all the arguments based on the idea that Madison's Federalist Number 10 and the Constitution of the United States are exclusively Lockean and are driven by a definition of human nature which is based on self-interest. Factionalism. I think that's really the threat. So consequently, many scholars have a vested interest in challenging the credibility of Garry Wills because Gary Wills is taking Madison and the U.S. Constitution in directions that these people don't want us to take it. People do not want, these folks do not want the general population to appreciate the extent to which Madison's education, Madison's worldview, was in large part defined by the Scottish Enlightenment, by David Robertson, who directed or headed the academy that Madison went to for 5 years as a youngster, from the time he was 11 to the time he was 16. And then when Madison went to Princeton, his education fell under the control of John Witherspoon. And John Witherspoon was a direct transplant of the Scottish Enlightenment. He came over here specifically to assume the presidency of Princeton. Madison spent 5 years of intensive study at Princeton. And to assume that this Scottish Enlightenment and the ideas which drove it didn't really impact Madison's thinking is absurd. At best, it's naive. At worst, it's duplicitous. Because it seems to me much more difficult to deny that influence than it is to accept it and to build one's understanding of the system around the realities that help to inform it. Anyway, that's my position. We are at 58 minutes after the hour. We've pretty well brought today's program to an end, and still we have 75 to 80% of Federalist 10 sitting in front of us. I love it, and I want to thank Bob for his contributions today. I want to thank John for his contributions yesterday. I really believe that the discussions and the conversations that we are having probably do more to inform and encourage people to gain an appreciation of Madison and of Federalist Number 10 that they never had before. I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center. I want to encourage you to have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Have a great week. Keep thinking. Stay involved. Every once in a while, I would ask you to check our Facebook page. Check the Virtual Center Facebook page. Sometime between now and the weekend, I'll try to post something as a lead-in for our programming next week, because it looks like we'll be launching next week the way we ended this one, which will be with an effort to try to digest and truly engage James Madison's mind in through Federalist Number 10. This is Bill O'Brien, thanking you very, very much. I want to encourage you to support the Head On Radio Network. Continue to tune in. Not only the Head On Network, but the Virtual Center as well. Thank you so much. I appreciate your participation and your willingness to join us. Have a great day and be safe.